Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our January webinar. My name is Madison Slater. I am the Executive VP of Security and Operations here at JSCM Group. We appreciate all of you attending this month. We're really excited about our 2023 webinar series, so I'll go into that in just a second. But again, as always, if you ever have questions throughout our webinars, we'll have a Q&A section at the end. Please feel free to send those over. So sit back, relax, and let's talk about this month's topic, which is establishing third-party risk management standards. Specifically, we're going to discuss how to develop a strategy to hold third parties accountable for the security of your data. So before we jump into the topic, one of the things that I want to share with you all with this new series is sort of what our approach is. So we at JSCM Group, we put a lot of focus on our knowledge of security, but also things that we're seeing in the industry, listening to the conversations that we have with our clients, and really using that as a way for us to figure out what is our next step? What is the thing that we're going to focus on? And the reality is that we've been having a lot of conversations recently about policies and how we manage certain pieces of our environment outside of just day-to-day IT, and honestly, even outside of specifically technology conversations themselves. Security is definitely something that over the years has really expanded outside of just IT. All organizations have different types of security standards and expectations, and the reality is that that impacts all pieces of the organization, whether it is the accounting side, the HR side, the executive side, down into our employees. All of us need to have some level of understanding when it comes to security. So what we wanted to do this year is create a 12-part series where we're going to talk about some of the big things that we're seeing, that we've had to deal with, that our clients are having to deal with, and use that as a way throughout the year to have a conversation about security as a whole. Now, we will focus each month on a particular topic, but the end result is that we want to have a year's worth of conversation where we're really trying to work towards bettering our security overall. I am a firm believer that when it comes to most things in life, but specifically when it comes to the security of our organization, we are not working towards perfection, because that's not possible. We're working towards improvement. If we are better today than we were yesterday, we've done it. We succeeded. So throughout this 12-part webinar series, we're going to be talking about different topics that relate to the overall management of security. Some of that is a little bit more IT focused, but a lot of this is going to talk about just security as a whole and how it impacts all of us. So this month, we're going to be talking about establishing our third-party risk management standards. I'm really excited about this topic. This is a big one that we've been having recently with a bunch of our clients. So I want to use some of that to really help drive the point that we're trying to make. So to start off this conversation, I want to first just ask the question, do you know every single third party that has access into your data for your organization? And I want you to really think about that. When we talk about security, when we talk about the need to implement new things, the need to implement new networking hardware or software that's going to protect our users from getting to certain things, when we talk about the ability to track devices, we need to consider what the ultimate goal is. And the ultimate goal is that we're trying to protect our data. Our data is the core of what our security efforts are working towards. So think about just day to day when we talk about security. Why do we focus on phishing? And why do we focus on training our users? Well, because we're worried that they're going to provide information, or that they're going to click on a link that's going to compromise their computer. Well, why are we actually worried about that computer getting compromised? We're worried about it getting compromised because if it's compromised, we're worried about what it has access to. And what does it have access to? Our data. We actually spend a lot of time, maybe not even realizing it, thinking about how we internally are managing our data. But the reality is that many organizations have started making a big shift, and we've started moving that outside of our control and putting that on someone else. So we, as an example, several years ago decided, nope, we don't want to have an internal Exchange server. We're going to put all of our email in 365. Great platform, offers a lot of benefits. My data now resides there. The reality is that we are using third parties for a lot of that. Where we stop the conversation, though, or where that thought process really gets paused, is in realizing that that data that we're so concerned with now, for a lot of us, doesn't even reside inside of an area that we can control. So, are we making sure that we're doing the things to protect it? And where we have to start is really asking ourselves, do we know every third party that has access to that data? Now, that access can come in a couple of different forms. We could think about that as direct access into our environment. So, do we have third parties that have VPN access in? But we also need to think about this from the perspective of other places that that data could reside. So, what we're going to talk about for this month is how we start to answer that question, and specifically what we do moving forward to make sure that we already know the answer to that question. When we talk about our data, I've worked at JSCM now for quite a while, and I've had a lot of different conversations over the years, and it's really interesting to talk to people about what their data is and what they consider to be secure and not secure. And this very often comes up on our assessment side, because one of the things that we always ask is, what do you consider the most important or confidential data that your organization has? And it is amazing to me throughout the years the amount of answers that have been, well, we don't really have any confidential data. Because that's an organization that's looking at it from the perspective of, we're not one of the big ones, right? We're not healthcare. We're not a financial institute. We're not really dealing with what is considered to be confidential data. We don't process payments. The reality, though, is that we all have data. Every single organization has data, whether it is something like that, like payment information, or something that, like healthcare information, or whether it's something simple or direct, like employee information. We all have it. The problem, though, is that it's very easy, or has been very easy, for us to just let that go. And I will say that I've been guilty of this in the past as someone who, my career is in IT, and there's a lot coming at me from all different angles, as all of you, I'm sure, are very aware of. So at some point, I start making the decision of, well, I don't have to host that internally. I can use another service, or I can put this somewhere else. The problem, though, is that then we can have the tendency to start blindly trusting that, right? Our data, in reality, can reside in a bunch of different areas that we don't even think about. There's going to be areas that are very obvious. So for me, yeah, 365. Got a lot of data there. We use that very heavily. But there are so many other areas that that data could be stored. There's so many other areas that that information could be that I don't necessarily have a lot of control over. So if you are an organization that uses a third-party payroll company, they're controlling that data. If you are an organization that has some type of document storage system that's not in-house, if your client database is stored in a program that you did not develop, that is a website that you access, all of that is your data, but it's being managed by a third party. We have to start considering what the possible ramifications of that are. Now, I am not, absolutely not, standing here telling you that you shouldn't use a third-party vendor. Absolutely not saying that. Trust me, I don't want to move our email back in-house. We don't want to move our payroll back in-house. That can be a lot. But what I do need to consider is that that data is ultimately my responsibility. I manage the security for JSCM Group. It is my responsibility to make sure that our data is secure. The problem that we often face, though, when we're talking about these systems is that we think that it gets us off the hook. We think that by putting it somewhere else, we're not responsible for it. So using the example of 365, I decided we didn't need an internal Exchange server, so we moved to 365 for email hosting. And then several years later, I said, you know what? Why do I have an internal file share server? We've got several remote employees. It makes it more difficult. Let's start putting everything in OneDrive and SharePoint. Works great. Now, I can easily say, well, I handed it over to Microsoft. It's their responsibility to make sure it's secure. And yes, a third party does have certain expectations and requirements for making sure that the information that we're providing to them is secured in some capacity. But ultimately, it's still my data. It's still my company's information. Even though I have put it in the hands of someone else, it is still my job to make sure that that is being managed appropriately. Data is more than what we often think of. It is in more places than we often realize. There's more access than we often know about, and we have to start changing that conversation. So one of the things that we do here at JSCM Group, we do a lot. We focus on security, but there's a lot of different aspects. And one of the things that we've been focusing on a lot lately is incident response. And we're focusing on that because even with all the technology out there, even with good configurations and good endpoint protection and well-trained users, there's always the possibility that a security incident will occur. So we focus on incident response so that our clients are prepared in the event that happens. And there's several ways that we go about incident response. One of those is to make sure that we're developing good incident response plans. An incident response plan is meant to give you a guide in the event a security issue occurs. Because if you think about it, let's use worst case scenario. If you walk in and your organization has been hit with ransomware, what's your initial reaction? It's to panic. It's a bad situation. That in particular is worst case scenario. So if we don't have a plan going into that, we can often be left standing in a room pointing fingers at each other, trying to figure out who's actually responsible. So having an incident response plan is really important. But for any good plan that you have in place, you need to have a way to test it. You need to have a way to make sure that it's actually going to hold up, that it's going to do the things that you want it to do. So part of our incident response planning is that we do tabletop exercises. Now, if you're not familiar with what a tabletop exercise is, honestly, I think it's one of the best things that has been developed when it comes to cybersecurity. If I have any fellow nerds on this call, think about Dungeons and Dragons, okay? I always equate it this way. So what a tabletop exercise is giving a scenario and then the opportunity to work through it. Now, unlike Dungeons and Dragons, you're not being thrown into a cave or you're having to battle a lot of bad guys. You're being put into a situation where you have to talk through a security incident. Tabletop exercises are wonderful because they allow you to practice, they allow you to review your incident response plan through a scenario that isn't real. So you can work through a ransomware incident without actually having a ransomware incident. Tabletop exercises work because they make us slow down. And so they make us talk through what our response would actually be. So typically what happens is I present a scenario. Sometimes it's very direct. Here's what has occurred. And sometimes it's just the first indicator that there could be an issue. So it could be something like you've received an email into your help desk that a user clicked on a link that they now think might have been suspicious. And you have to work through it. Once the scenario is presented, the organization that we're doing this with, they then have to have the discussion. So we are basically just there to act as their guide, but we're not necessarily going to give them their next step. Because what we're trying to do is figure out, do you have a plan? Do you know what you would do next? Who are you communicating with? How are you documenting it? Who are you going to be reaching out to? How are you alerting people? Tabletop exercises are great. Love them. So for any of you that have talked to me directly, you probably know this. I love telling stories. I love using examples, especially when it comes to security to make a point. So I want to use an example from one of our most recent tabletop exercises. The focus was on this particular thing that we're talking about, third-party involvement. The results of that tabletop are actually what initiated this whole conversation. So we're coming full circle. So this tabletop was a pretty direct one. We wanted to focus specifically on third parties in an organization and what would happen. Why did I pick this one? Because I knew they wouldn't have an answer. I hoped they would, but I also understand the reality is that not a lot of organizations have actually asked themselves this question. We've been very focused on our own environment, our internal access, but we often forget that there are other pieces out there that are involved. So the overall scenario was that this organization, Company X, has a third party in place. So just to make this a little bit, I guess to hit home a little bit, put your organization's name in Company X. So think about who you are. This is your company. And the scenario is that you have a third party in use, and the third party has had a security incident. Now, the way that I set up this scenario, because again, it's like Dungeons and Dragons, it's fake, but to try and make it hit home a little bit more, the scenario that I used was that this was a service that the organization was using for file storage. So in your organization, think if you have something like that. So for me, I would say something like 365. SharePoint, OneDrive, that's where we're storing the majority of our files. If you use something like Dropbox, include that. Think about something that you use that's outside of your organization, outside of your control, that has something of your data. So the scenario was that this organization had received an alert from the tool that they used or the service that they used. So we used the scenario of CloudStor. This was the third-party tool that we said they used. And basically they were just sending out an alert saying, hey, we had a situation. Some of your information might have been exposed. This scenario, not uncommon. This has happened multiple times. Think about it even in your personal life. The amount of times you've probably gotten an email from a service that you use saying, hey, turns out we had a little bit of a data breach. This happens, okay? So this is the scenario. And this is all I did. I said, you received an email. This is the email from CloudStor. It had a little bit more information, but this is a tool that you use. They've had a data breach. They cannot confirm that the data on their site that you have there wasn't accessed. They're not sure. So they're telling you, assume it was, and plan accordingly on your end. And then I handed it over to the organization and said, okay, what do you do? And we did the scenario with a few different organizations, and I can say that the immediate response was often silence. Why? Because they didn't have a plan for this. They had not thought through this. And again, that's the reality that we're seeing with a lot of people, is that we've got third parties in place and we're not thinking about, well, what if their data, what if their system gets compromised? We're using that mentality of it's not my problem because it's not me. It's not my server. And honestly, that was some of the feedback that was being shared around the table, which was, well, I mean, surely they've got a team of people that's going to, forensically investigate. Yeah, they probably do. Still your data, still your information. So what are you going to do? And what we found in having those tabletop conversations and just bringing up this topic on other calls and things like that is that the question often turns to, well, who is responsible? And the answer honestly can vary depending on what department you're in and what your role is. Now, for those of you on this call who specifically are in IT, we all know that at some point they're going to look at us, right? You use a computer to access it, so they're probably going to come to us. One of the scenarios, though, that we were dealing with, we were talking to the IT people, and they had, just to make their scenario hit a little bit more, they had said, well, let's pretend, at the beginning, they said, let's say that this is our payroll tool. They had a third-party payroll tool that had a bunch of their data, and so they said, okay, yeah, let's just use that. So when it came time to answer, what do we do next, there was very much a hands up in the air kind of, well, we don't manage it. In IT, we don't touch that. Okay. So no one else in your organization is ever going to come to you and say, hey, what do I do about this? What happens in a lot of these situations is that we can't actually answer this question. We don't know who's responsible. We don't know if that email comes in, who's going to be the one that addresses it? Who's going to be the one that sends out the alert? Who's going to be the one in contact with the third party to determine what they've been doing? We don't have an answer for that. And that's where we start to get in trouble. Now, what's even worse about this, and what makes that question even harder to answer, is that there are plenty of tools in your environment that you might not know about for one, but have any insight over on the other. So it makes it even harder to answer that question of who is responsible. And that was the feedback from from the client that said that this is the payroll company. They said, well, we in IT, we didn't pick that. We don't manage it. We didn't do any, that system was picked. We didn't have any say over it. It was like, okay. But again, they're still going to come to you. So therein lies the problem. Therein lies our inability to answer the question of who was responsible because we didn't have that conversation up front. The issue is that we need to be doing more before we even get to the point of picking those vendors. Now, you're going to have a lot of systems already in place, as we do, when we started asking ourselves this question. So part of this is going to be thinking about it from the perspective of not just what you do if it's someone or a new service or a new third party that you're implementing, but what do you do about the ones that are already in place? Anytime we're dealing with a third party, whether it's some sort of cloud provider, so it could be something large like Azure or AWS, you're hosting certain systems up there, could be a smaller thing, maybe like a local payroll or HR company that you're using. Regardless of what it is, they may be managing our data, but if that gets impacted, if they get compromised, if they're not doing their due diligence in backing up that data, it still affects us. Even if it's not a direct system compromise, it impacts us because, again, that is our data. If it's our payroll company, if we use a third-party payroll company, and something about their security fails and their environment gets compromised, yes, that is their environment. It is their job to restore that and to get that back into place. But my employee's social security number is still impacted. I can't change that. That information got out. So even though it was the payroll company's responsibility for making sure that that information was secured, I'm the one that ultimately said that they were put in charge of it. So we need to be able to fix this problem by having processes in place before we even select the vendor. Now, again, you're going to have vendors that are already in place that you might already have some in your head going, oh, wait, I don't know. I don't know if they're doing it right. And you may be sitting there thinking there could be a lot of stuff that is in use that I have no clue about. And we can't change the past. We can't go back in time. So we have to figure out how we're going to fix it moving forward. And even if that vendor is already in place, we will be able to implement some of the same standards. But we have to have that process, especially if we are implementing someone new, so that we can start correcting it moving forward. Again, we're not aiming for perfection. We're aiming for improvement. So even if you can't immediately change all the vendors that you are already using or all the third parties that you are already using, you can at least improve it for the next one. Again, I like to use stories. I like to use examples. I'll use one about us this time. So over the summer of last year, 2022, we decided that we wanted to start looking at a new third-party payroll company. And so we do have internal processes for what we're doing to make sure that those are what we need them to be. So depending on what it is, it's going to be looked at initially by different people in the organization. So the first option that we looked at had been pre-vetted by a couple of people just from I call it the bells and whistles side. What can the service do? They liked it. They did a demo. They talked to the company. Looks great. Cool. So then it got passed over to me because I do handle a lot of our internal security, and I had to vet it from my perspective. Now, we do have certain standards when it comes to working with a third party. I cannot say these have always been in place because, again, improvement, not perfection. And we learn, right? But we do have standards. And one of those standards I think is very straightforward. We require that the environment be able to enforce MFA. Now, if it can do something like tie in with SAML, so we can tie it into our current MFA solution, even better. But at the very least, I need to be able to enforce it, even if it is not something that is tied into our current environment. At the very least, I need to be able to enforce it so they can use it. So I did an initial call with this payroll company candidate and just said, you know, we've got a couple of things we want to make sure are in place. First is MFA. We want to make sure that when our users are logging in, obviously they enter a password, but that there's some sort of secondary prompt. And there was a moment of silence. And then there was an, so what do you mean by MFA? I was like, oh, okay. Well, we need to be able to provide some level of secondary authentication and verification. And I had to explain to them what MFA was. We did not end up going with this payroll vendor. Why? Because they didn't have MFA. They didn't have one of the standards that we have in place. We picked someone else. That's okay. You need to set what your expectations are moving into that conversation. You need to know what you're going to hold them accountable to before you ever sign on the dotted line. And sometimes it means that you pick someone else. Sometimes it means that they can't answer yes to the question that you asked. So you say, thank you for your efforts, but this is not going to be a good fit. Why? Because it is your data. It is yours. You have to protect it. If we don't start implementing standards before we actually start implementing the tool or the service or whatever it is, the relationship where they have access into our environment, we are always going to be susceptible to something happening that is outside of our control. Now, how do we create internal standards? There's a bunch of different ways that you can approach this. One thing that organizations will do is they will have that internal incident response team. Now, that team can serve two purposes. One is that they are going to be the ones responsible in the event something happens. There's a team of people who knows exactly what to do. They're going to coordinate the response on the issue. Oftentimes, though, your incident response team, they can be the ones that are helping vet that. They can be the ones that are asking those questions because they know what can happen from the security standpoint. Establishing a communication team or a communication pathway is so important because using the example of that third party that got compromised, when that email comes in, who are you telling? Who's going to be alerted? How are you getting the word out to your employees? Or if it's something that impacts your customer data, what is the communication pathway for that? A responsible party document, this can come in a lot of different forms, but at its base, it is something that says for this vendor or this tool or this third party, here's who's responsible. Here's who's going to be in charge of making sure that that's secure internally. Here's who's going to be responsible for holding them accountable. Requesting annual reports of cybersecurity standards or practices, do that. Go to them and say, hey, what do your cybersecurity reports look like? Can you provide me some information on what you guys are doing? And ultimately, a list, an idea, a standard for vendors of your expectations for them before you ever put any data in their system. We need to make sure that we are on the same page internally and that the vendor is working in our standards, not the other way around. The reality is that for most of us, we're doing the work, right? Like we're doing at least as much as we can. We're trying. We're implementing secure passwords, or we're turning on MFA, or we're going through assessments, or we're putting our users through training. Why don't we do the same for them? Why don't we hold them to the same standards? Because the reality is that the threat will come from them, just as likely as it will from inside of the network, just as likely as it will from inside of our organization. We require that our users go through regular security training. Why don't we require that our third parties are getting regular security audits? We require internally that our data is backed up and that it's tested. Why don't we require proof of that from our third parties that are storing the other parts of our data? The threat will come from them not having standards, but the issue is that we're not holding them accountable to those. We're just saying, okay, here's my data. Hope you're doing it right. I'm going to trust you. And we can't, because there's no guarantee that they're going to do the things that we think they're doing unless we are setting those expectations and actually holding them accountable to it. There are tons of different vendor standards that you can implement depending on your organization, depending on the type of data that they're storing. I think these are some of the basic ones. If they have your data, they should be able to provide proof of a third-party security assessment. An assessment points out what issues they have. They should be going through one of those. It's a very healthy process. Honestly, MFA on all their platforms, that should be a basic one. They should have MFA. We all know that passwords are bad. Passwords suck. You can breach a password. You can compromise a password. Put MFA on it. It's not hard. Just do it. Data controls. They need to have processes in place that say how they're controlling their data, how they're encrypting it, how they're transferring it, how they're backing it up. And they should be able to share that with you. Because if their business is storing data, they should just have that available. If they actually take it seriously, if they take security seriously, when you say, hey, what are your data controls? They can say, yep, here you go. This is what we do. If they are, especially if this is in a particular industry, but if they have compliance standards that they are adhering to. There are plenty of compliance standards out there that are not even industry specific, but show your focus on security. So what are those? What compliance are you doing? What's your incident response plan? If my data does get compromised because your system is breached, what plan are you going through to make sure that it's properly restored and protected moving forward? These are not uncommon things, and especially think about it from the perspective your organization is probably doing a lot of these, at least internally on yourselves. Don't treat them any differently. I will never tell you to not use a third party because, again, it makes my life easier. It makes your life easier. All that I'm saying is that we need to be setting better expectations for what that involvement, what that relationship or engagement looks like. Last year, we started through a process of really trying to true up a lot of our own security practices. We're a security company. We think about it a lot. It's always good to have someone come in and double check you and tell you things that maybe you didn't think about. So we decided to start with our SOC 2. We were very excited about this, and I'm going to be very honest with all of you. It was one of the hardest things that we have ever done, but it was also one of the most healthy things that we have ever done. We had a lot of the things in place. We were doing them in practice. We didn't necessarily have all of them written out the way that we needed, or there were some areas that we weren't doing proper checks and balances. It's okay. Again, no one's expected to be perfect. What we were trying to do was improve. Going through our SOC 2 audit taught us as a company so much, and honestly, it's part of what is driving the conversation over the next year with this webinar series. What did we have to go through that we can go ahead and tell you about? Even if you're not going through an audit, these are good things. These are things to help you improve. And honestly, it's why we focus on the things that we do. It's why we do a lot of testing, and it's why we do security training. It's why we manage a lot of devices. It's why we're doing a new big focus on incident response. These are the things that can impact us. Locking down your computer is really important. Having good endpoint protection is really important. But if you don't have processes in place for the way your data is being handled, for how you're hardening your computers, for what you're going to do in the event there is a security incident, at the end of the day, those are the things that can impact you at a larger and deeper level. So what we want to do this year is really show what our experience has been and use that as a way to help set you on the right path. Now, going into this new webinar series, we were really excited about this, with sharing this information, and then the conversation was ultimately, well, what do they do next? Because we can talk about this, right? We can talk about this, but where do you start? So one of the things that we're going to start doing is we're going to start putting out some templates that will help put you on the path. Now, these templates are meant to be starting points. These are meant to say, hey, if you don't have anything at all, here's some standards that you can start implementing. Here's some processes or policies that you can start implementing. So the one that we're going to start with is our third-party risk management template. And we've actually got two different things that we've created for you. One is an actual policy, and you'll see it's a Word document. You can put your company name in, it will fill it out. Now, just having that doesn't mean that you are better. It means that you are on your path. You still need to look through it, you need to work through it, you need to get people on board, but it is at least a starting point. The other thing that we're providing to you is a questionnaire. Questions you should be asking your vendors. Asking them up front, what are you doing for this process? What's your security testing? All of those, I'll pause here for just a second. You can go ahead and grab them if you click on this QR code. They're going to be available on our website. We really want to use this as an opportunity to start that process. You might be an organization that already has a lot of policies in place, in which case, maybe you don't have this one. Stick it into your policy book. You might be someone who's sitting there saying, we have nothing. You've got something now. You have a starting point. We don't want to just talk about this. We want to actually give you actionable things that you can do. But just having the policy isn't enough. Just having it written down isn't enough. You have to make sure that it works for you, and then you have to make sure that you're enforcing it. But it at least puts you on the pathway to start that conversation. Again, this year we're really trying to focus on knowledge sharing. We can do webinars where we talk about, here's the in-depths of this technology and this hardware or whatever. Ultimately, that only reaches a certain group of people. This is important to everyone. All of our companies are susceptible to security incidents. So what we want to do through this year, through our webinar series, is to take these individual conversations, to dive into them, to talk more in depth about these areas that could be dangerous if we're not really thinking about it. And what we want to do is let those build over the year, so that at the end of the year, we're going to have a big discussion about incident response. Because ultimately, even if we put all of this security in place, if we have all of these conversations, there's always the possibility. So we can at least start working towards the bigger picture, and then talk about, in the event something were to still happen, what do we do? I really appreciate all of you taking time to join us this month. I hope that you got something out of this at the very least. Hopefully it sparked some additional thoughts, not to put more on everyone's plate, because I know we're all busy. But again, I think this is something that often goes unnoticed. It's not something that we talk about necessarily at the level that we should be. We have a lot of data out there, and at the end of the day, we need to just make sure that it's secure. Thank you all for attending. If you have any questions, please send those over. We've got a few minutes left before the end of our session. As always, if you don't have a question right now, but one pops up in the future, reach out to us. We're always happy to discuss this. Get us on the phone. We'll talk about it, talk about some of your particular issues if there's a situation that you're dealing with. I know this was one that has come up with several of our clients over the last few months, but if there's anything else surrounding your security, we're always happy to answer those as well. All right, not seeing any questions immediately, so again, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. We hope to hear from you. Oh, sorry, I just got a comment. As a former operations manager, it's pretty clear to me that IT operations is headed the same direction. Our customers are increasingly requesting this stuff. Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, and honestly, I mean, we get these requests too, right? Like, we're a third party, and we expect that. So I am glad to know that you're seeing that a little bit more too. So Thank you all again for your time. I really appreciate it. If you have questions in the future, if you need some assistance, never hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you all, and we look forward to talking to you next month.